Our reading today on the Sunday before Advent, comes from the end of Luke's Gospel in chapter 23. It's the account of the crucifixion of Jesus. And what we've heard before our reading is the way in which people bring Jesus to Pilate. He sends him off to Herod, who brings him back to Pilate. And we have from verse 13 of chapter 23 onwards a threefold restatement by Pilate that he can find absolutely nothing wrong with Jesus. But the hostility, the anger, the horror of the crowd who bay for blood and seek the release of Barabbas instead of Jesus is quite shocking to hear. Jesus is led away by the soldiers, and Jesus says to some of the women who are crying and wailing for his imminent death that these are indeed dark times. So we read from verse 33 until 43. Whenever you hear a story of suffering of somebody who you love and someone who you know, an experience, of course, which unfortunately is unfolding right now for many, many people around the world, it's one that's shockingly horrific, a situation that you would seek to avoid, of course. But our task today, of course, is to look at the reading and to understand what the gospel writer is trying to say and what we can take away and deduce about our own relationship with God and the world and its people. So, verse 33. When they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there, and the two criminals, one on his right and the other on his left. Jesus said, "Forgive them, Father. They don't know what they are doing." They divided his clothes amongst themselves by throwing dice. The people stood there watching, while the Jewish leaders jeered at him. "He saved others. Let him save himself if he is the Messiah whom God has chosen." The soldiers also mocked him. They came up to him and offered him cheap wine and said, "Save yourself if you are the King of the Jews." Above whom were written these words, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals hanging there hurled insults at him. "Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us." The other one, however, rebuked him, saying, "Don't you fear God? You received the same sentence he did. Ours, however, is only right, because we are getting what we deserve for what we did. But he has done no wrong." And he said to Jesus, "Remember me, Jesus, when you come as King." Jesus said to him, "I promise you that today you will be in paradise with me." It's a terrible scene with a passive, aggressive crowd who stand there in the face of such torture and suffering and humiliation and do nothing but look on with morbid fascination. We have the sneers and the jeers of the religious authorities who have finally triumphed. They are able to get rid of this irksome, annoying irritant. We have the soldiers joining in, and we have one of the criminals also hurling insults as a result of his petrified situation, but also through some kind of misguided desire that Jesus would just make it all better. So in some ways, in this account, we have a microcosm of all the possible human reactions where to a person who embodies love and graciousness and kindness and acceptance and lives without prejudice and seeks only to do what is right and what is good, what is creative and what builds people up. for all these different people show different facets of life, facets that we ourselves reveal, of course, in our daily interactions with people. We have references to the Old Testament. We often think of the suffering servant from Isaiah, but actually it's from the Psalms that we draw much of this material. The dividing of clothes, the feeding of vinegar instead of nourishing water, all come from different Psalms. But the key thing here, for me at least, is the people's reactions. How often have you and I stood, as the crowd did, in the face of somebody else's suffering and done nothing? How often have we been morbidly fascinated with the fear and tribulation of others and not actually got involved and not spoken out, joined sheep-like with people who simply go with the flow? How often has our own pride and our sense of status and our sense of importance made us judge others, if not actually sneer and jeer, to sit in judgment and to feel self-satisfied and justified? How often, because of the roles that society puts us in, do we feel justified in treating others with less than grace and love and kindness, as the soldiers did? So it's the one criminal who says, in his extreme agony and pain, of course, that Jesus has done no wrong and has this realization of what is happening. It's a phenomenal moment, an incredible moment, because this person is not part of the crowd, healthy and fine, with a life to look forward to and the rest of the day to enjoy. He too is approaching death, and yet he recognizes that Jesus is there, sinless and undeserving of this fate. He steps out of himself, even in this incredible situation. But of course, this has nothing to do with the man himself, but what God is able to do through him when he opens his heart and mind to what is actually happening before him. Because what is going on is that God in human form is being killed, put to death in the most horrific of ways, in a public disgrace, not only coupled with that physical agony. So it's quite something that the person in that extremis opens themselves to God. But this actually is the situation for so many of us. When we're brought low, when we know we are at the end of our tether, when perhaps even the end of life is something that we look into, then there can be a moment of pure revelation that God is all we have and all we need, and that God is there in the horrendous situation that we find ourselves. And this, of course, can, for so many of us, be a tremendous revelation, a sense of great joy, a sense of peace, and a sense of strength, even in the midst of what others would call unbearable suffering. Because this is the truth of our situation. God is with us, and God's strength is beyond our understanding. Always and everywhere, we are loved by God because we are God's children. Everything that the rest of the players in this account show tells us of how people can spend their lives not living that beautiful truth, of how instead of regarding others as brothers and sisters, as fellow children of the God who made them, but as people to judge, people to bypass, people to ignore, people to hate, people to judge, people to be prejudiced against. These are all the things of the world. But the man on the cross next to Jesus is able to recognize through God's grace that this is a travesty, that here in this situation, all that's happened is that people have been confronted with the light of pure love, and their reaction is hatred and anger, cursing and venom, and he will have none of it. In all our situations, in all our conversations, in all our dealings with our fellow human beings, wherever they are and whoever they are, may our interactions be characterized by that Christ-like acceptance, by that knowledge, that truth that we are all God's children, that God loves each and every one of us the same. And so we are called to recognize that truth and to live it out in our lives. Everybody matters. Everyone's important. Nobody is to be despised. Worst of all, in the name of the religion we profess, that should ever cause us to be judgmental or superior to another person. The God who made all things knows nothing about these things and cares nothing about these things. The beautiful truth of what God showed us in Jesus is that everyone matters, that God has time and love for everybody, and that in extraordinary situations of pain and suffering, God is there. In times of joyful partying and dancing, God is there. Always and everywhere we can wake up to that reality and that truth, that we live a life entrusted to us by the God who made us. And our mission, our ministry, is to love and serve others as we ourselves have been loved, and to share that this liberating, unifying love is for all people in all situations.